Hello, everyone. I'm Aminda Smith, and I'd like to welcome you to the second part of the Viral Politics series organized by the Critical China Scholars. Tonight's discussion will continue to investigate what left perspectives can and must illuminate about China and the world. Our particular focus this evening will be how racism and nationalism shape understandings of China. And these are certainly timely topics as we in the United States brace for the annual celebration of US nationalism on July 4th. Although many of us will actively resist any such celebration, the patriotic observance will proceed nonetheless, with far too little official acknowledgement and even less concrete reparation for the long history of systemic racism on which this country was built and on which it continues to run. We stand behind Black Lives Matter and all anti-racist activists who are fighting for real structural change. Racism is a central concern for the Critical China Scholars. We identify our views as broadly leftist because we link racism to nationalism and capitalism rather than seeing it as an autonomous realm of cultural expression. In a world where racist, ethno-nationalist, and neoliberal ideologies masquerade as natural, we seek to do our part to present the radical idea that there are always alternatives to injustice and inequality. We seek to intervene and to amplify other leftist interventions into this very fraught political moment to help create the possibility for those alternatives to be thought and produced. This group formed as many of us became increasingly concerned by recent international developments in which institutions and individuals mobilize racist, nationalist, and capitalist practices and discourses to create contentious relations that have manifestly produced tragedy and hardship. On the one hand, especially in the United States, Australia, parts of Europe, politicians and pundits are demonizing the PRC in their rhetoric and policies, which is fueling anti-Asian racism and xenophobia in everyday social interactions. These moves continue a long history of racism and discrimination in these places, and they have had poisonous effects for too long. We believe that a critique of racism must be central to any left intervention. We are equally concerned that some segments of the self-identified left have begun insisting that the way to oppose white racism and Western imperialism is to throw unquestioned support behind the government of the People's Republic of China. Some go so far as to argue that not supporting the PRC state is itself a rejection based on racist thinking. So even as the Chinese government silences and imprisons workers, feminists, activists, and others, a loud contingent continues to insist that the left must support the PRC state, or else leftists can be neither anti-racist nor anti-imperialist. We disagree. We acknowledge the outsized role that racism plays in global understandings of China. We actively resist xenophobic racist rhetoric. We similarly acknowledge the grave injustices committed around the world by the United States and some of its allies, and we welcome the decline of US global hegemony. But we nonetheless refuse to advocate positions that understate the very serious violations of human rights committed by all states, including the US and the PRC. Accordingly, we stand in solidarity with activists around the world who are fighting for justice, for peace, for labor solidarity, civil liberties and academic freedom, gender equality, indigenous rights, LGBTQ rights, especially when those projects are based on broad anti-nationalist and anti-capitalist critique. Our loyalty, thus, is not to any state. We recognize that the root cause of injustice lies in political and economic systems, including capitalism, authoritarianism, imperialism, racism, and patriarchy, and we know that those transcend national boundaries. So we invite you to help us face the challenge of articulating a non-reductionist and internationalist revolutionary politics that does not allow one priority to outweigh others. You can read our full statement of principles at criticalchinascholars.org, which we will link in the chat. Crucially, however, while the members of this group agree with those general principles, we disagree amongst ourselves on the best specific analyses and proposed solutions. We debate each other vigorously, and we are incredibly grateful for all of the critical feedback and engaged discussions on our Facebook page and in the chats during our events, and in the personal emails that you sent to many of our members, all of which challenge us to think more deeply and more clearly about the complexity of the issues that we debate. Our goal is not to produce a line on any of these issues. If solutions could be formulated so simply, we wouldn't still be here. Looking at the names of some of the people who are here tonight, I know that some of you have been fighting this fight for decades, but you also know better than anyone else that there have been moments of real possibility in the long history of the left. And we see this as another such moment, a moment when we are so close to uniting on our common ground, which we can see is extensive despite our genuine but productive disagreements. Right now, in the US, in China, and elsewhere, despite the best efforts of states to deter them, people are making meaningful political interventions that are having profound impacts. Revolutionary change is possible. So thank you for joining us tonight to work together against the tensions that threaten to rip us apart, to investigate those conditions of possibility, to help us do our part to further the radical political thinking and activism that we are witnessing at this moment. We hope our discussions can serve as critical resources for scholars, activists, and anyone attempting to address structural conflicts rather than giving into the racism and nationalism that only serve to hide the systems that oppress us all. So again, our heartfelt thanks to all of you for being here, and a huge round of thanks also to our generous comrade sponsors, Verso, Haymarket Books, N+1, Made in China Journal, The Nation, New Politics, The Spectre Journal, Positions Politics, the Political Economy Research Institute, Justice is Global, and Science for the People. Our comments tonight will be presented in pairs. I will pose a broad question and then introduce each speaker before they offer 5 minutes each of remarks. And after that, we'll open things up to the discussion. As I said earlier, to ensure as stable a connection as possible, we're gonna ask that you all keep your microphones muted and that you turn off your video. As much as we would love to see your faces, and as much as we would love to take spoken questions from you all, the group is just too big. So we're gonna ask that you ask your questions in the chat. You can also ask questions on the Facebook page where this is being streamed live. If you have any trouble connecting to Zoom, you can join the live screen on the Critical China Scholars Facebook page, and you don't have to be a Facebook member to visit that page. The Critical China Scholars whose faces you do not see here are working hard behind the scenes to manage the live stream and to collect and aggregate your questions. Okay, so our first pair of speakers includes Fabio Lanza and Sigrid Schmalzer. During our last event, a number of people on the panel and in the audience raised the question of imperialism and the fact that resisting imperialism has long been foundational to leftist politics. And this is certainly indicative of a debate on the left at the movement about whether China can and does challenge US imperialism and what China's status is vis-a-vis imperialism and the left. So we'll hear first from Fabio Lanza, who is professor of Chinese history at the University of Arizona and the author of a recent book on the Committee of Concerned Asian Scholars. Fabio, can you talk a little bit about how leftists have imagined the connection between imperialism and China historically, and what we might make of that question today?
Okay, well, I think if you ask any of us now if we are anti-imperialist, I think each of us will probably answer immediately, yes, of course, but then quickly add, but what do you mean by that? Because I think while anti-imperialist as a political position seems both obvious and righteous, imperialism is bad and therefore opposing imperialism is good. I would like to argue here that the meaning of anti-imperialism as the meaning of imperialism is not always obvious, and that because it's not obvious, while an anti-imperialist position might seem natural, it's not necessarily useful or productive. And to be clear, I'm not arguing for not taking an anti-imperialist position. I'm just pointing out the rhetorical and political problems that arise when we do that, especially in relationship with China. Let me use an historical precedence to set the issue. In the late 1960s, it was quite obvious what it meant to be anti-imperialist. There was one state power, which was deploying enormous military and economic resources around the world, which was holding up puppet regime in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, and most visibly was waging a murderous war in China. So in the late 60s, being anti-imperialist meant being against US imperialism. The sympathy with which China was viewed by people around the world and the incredible popularity of Maoism at the time in the late 60s can at least be in part ascribed to the People's Republic of China unwavering condemnation of US imperialism and its rhetorical and at times practical support for the liberation of colonized people. And that included the liberation of Black radicals in the United States who, following Malcolm X, considered themselves to be internally colonized. Mao himself spoke and wrote repeatedly in support of civil rights and Black liberation, and it's therefore not surprising that Maoism played a crucial role in organizations such the Black Panthers by giving them the theoretical language to connect the African-American struggle for liberation within the US with the global anti-imperialist and decolonization movements. Now, if you fast forward just a few years to the fall of 1971, Huey Newton, the founder and main theoretician of the Black Panthers Party, was in China. He had accepted an invitation from the CCP to visit Beijing. And on October 5th, 1971, at the large meeting in the Great Hall of the People, Premier Zhou Enlai had the unenviable task of telling Newton and the other pro-China foreign visitors that were gathered there that the CCP was inviting and President Nixon to visit China the following year. Zhou reassured the visitors that the CCP would continue to support leftists and revolutionary fighters globally, while at the same time negotiating with their enemies. But it was clear, despite Zhou's reassurance, that a major fracture had appeared in the anti-imperialist front, and that the relationship between China and that front had suddenly become way more complicated. Now, since 1971, what anti-capitalism means and the relationship of China with anti-imperialism means and the relationship of China to that category has only become more complex and more obscure. So when we are asked, are you anti-imperialist? I don't think we are really asked to interrogate that complexity. We're simply asked to make a choice to choose a side. For some pro-China leftists, being anti-imperialist still means kind of the same thing. It still means opposing US policies worldwide, and especially opposing what's considered interference in what are supposed to be internal Chinese affairs. For people of Hong Kong, of Taiwan, of Tibet, of Xinjiang, and for people who support them, being anti-imperialist means calling China the new imperial power. As Brian Hugh has pointed out in a recent article in New Blue magazine, which I invite you to read, when it comes to these issues, we have two supposedly opposing groups perfectly mirroring each other. The pro-China leftists dismissed the Hong Kong protests, for example, as anti-socialist and funded by the CIA, while at the same time they support Black Lives Matter. On the other side, the American right condemns Black Lives Matter, almost in the same terms, to being funded and supported by supposed foreign agitators, but celebrates Hong Kong protesters for being democratic, truly grassroots, bottom-up movement. Now, this is a choice in front of us when we are asked the question, are you anti-imperialist? And I don't believe it is a choice we should make. Not just because it's a choice which requires allegiance to a imaginary, mostly imaginary idea of what democracy and socialism mean, but more importantly, because it prevents us from actually identifying the very practice that constitutes imperialism today. Now, without going to a theoretical debate, I think we can all agree that imperialism is alive and well today, and that a series of national and non-national entities are involved in different ways and different times in the systematic exploitation of certain parts of the world. So imperialism today is perhaps better viewed as a worldwide system. And in this system, China is at times behaving as an imperialist power, and at times it's not. However, in this system, there are people who always or most of the times participate in the system only as the exploited and the oppressed. So if we have to choose a side, I would say that we should stand with these people. But even that is difficult unless we are clear about the mechanism of oppression, exploitation, and extraction. Now, I don't have the time here to go into details, but I would simply suggest that instead of asking who is imperialist and who is not, it might be more useful to follow the patterns of capital accumulation and exploitation of resources. And these patterns are as often intranational as they are transnational. And I think this also allows us to identify potential paths of solidarity, paths that are absolutely invisible if we stick to a simplistic and Manichaean view of imperialism. I'll stop here.
Thank you. We'll hear next from Sigrid Schmalzer, who is professor of history at University of Massachusetts Amherst, and who has also played a central role in the revitalization of the radical US organization Science for the People. Sigrid, can you talk a little bit about what significance China's revolutionary history has held for US leftists historically, and what challenges those leftists have faced in developing a political analysis of the PRC, and then directly to the topic of the session, how have racism and nationalism added to those challenges?
Okay, thank you, Mindy. I'm going to frame my comments around a specific example from a leftist US group that I'm involved with called Science for the People, which originally emerged during the Vietnam War era and was rebooted a few years ago. So beginning at the very beginning, from its very founding, Science for the People sought to expose the ways that science in the US served imperialism, racism, capitalism, and patriarchy. And so its members welcomed the opportunity to travel to socialist China in 1973 to see what Science for the People looked like. Following a 4-week visit, the delegation returned to the US and published a book titled China, Science Walks on Two Legs. Now, about 6 months ago, a handful of members from the new Science for the People digitized that book and proposed to republish it on our website. And the discussion that then ensued on our listserv really reflected the challenges for US leftists who seek to engage with China in ways that constitute genuine international solidarity and avoid the snares of racism and nationalism. Some of our members saw republishing the book as a way of countering the anti-China rhetoric of the Trump regime and reminding people of the very real inspiration that Mao-era China offered for the people's science movement around the world. But others were concerned about appearing to endorse the book's perspectives. For one thing, US leftists today are divided when it comes to Mao-era China, as people have built relationships with Chinese intellectuals in particular. They've heard firsthand accounts of persecution. And then many US leftists, for that reason, are now abashed by how readily they accepted what the Mao-era state reported. But this shift in how people view the Cultural Revolution was produced not just by people-to-people contacts. The involvement of the PRC state in creating the new narrative on the Cultural Revolution in particular makes things considerably more complicated. So Science for the People actually sent a second delegation to China in 1978, but by then the radicals had been deposed and the delegates faced a very confusing situation in which much of what they had learned in 1973 from the state was now being contradicted by the state, the new regime. So following, what Fabio highlighted in terms of that, 1971-72 watershed, I would emphasize that the CCP's course change in 78, that that period produced an even deeper split that leftists globally are very much still living with. Another thing that concerns many of us about republishing the book is the problematic implication that our best source of information on China is, frankly, a bunch of white people with no knowledge of the language who kind of experienced China over the course of a few weeks and then came back to share their impressions with their friends and colleagues. And honestly, I have to say this tendency is still at play in the US today. I very recently heard someone explaining to an audience, I might add, that had plenty of Chinese people in it, that concerns about censorship in China were overblown. And his evidence was that he had been to banquets where people spoke to him freely of their criticisms of the state. So I would argue this kind of attitude undermines the solidarity that we might forge with activists in China who are indeed very much constrained by censorship. I also want to say, I recall that when COVID-19 was spreading through China and US communities began worrying about it coming here, official communications, even on university campuses, talked about China as a place that we should worry about traveling to, and not as a place that is in fact home for many people in our communities. So what I want to emphasize here is, I don't mean to criticize Science for the People in particular, much less any of the specific people who went on that trip. That was really the way things went with Western delegations to China in the 1970s. And, as I've just mentioned, I think it's very much at play today as well. But the question is rather what we as self-respecting anti-racist leftists do with our own history. And whether in the 1970s or today, when we imagine China as an exotic land that one travels to and then gives reports on, we often end up romanticizing, mystifying, and objectifying China. And also, crucially, we often end up conflating China with the nation state, so that China is understood in ways that are profoundly racialized and nationalized. So while nationalism can be and has been an essential defensive force against imperialism historically, it also presents major problems for leftists, including for Science for the People, as we grapple with the big questions before us. And I'll just give a couple of examples before wrapping up. One, how do we understand what indigenous knowledge is in China? Is all Chinese knowledge indigenous by virtue of its subject position vis-a-vis Western colonialism? Or are there indigenous knowledges within China that have been colonized by the Han-dominated state? So I think the model that Fabio was giving us could be very helpful in grappling with this. Also, what is the significance in China of the food sovereignty movement? Is it about China as a nation state protecting its sovereignty against Western encroachment? Or is it about connecting to a global peasant movement to protect the rights of farmers against capitalism in all its forms? So I'll just end by saying, the decision we came to in the New Science for the People was to republish the text of the original book, but to include alongside it a set of historically and critically conscious analyses that reveal both the book's political significance and its limitations. And we're working on that now. That's an ongoing project that will be part of our efforts to grapple with our own organization's historical entanglements with racism and nationalism, with the hope that we can strengthen our efforts at international solidarity in the future. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Our next pair of speakers include Alex Lee and Shan Windscript, who will talk about the racialized dimensions of COVID-19 in relation to the global rise of nationalisms. We'll hear first from Alex Lee, who is an international student studying and living in Sydney, Australia. Alex, thank you for being here and for offering to share some of your experience related to the recent COVID-19 travel bans, everyday racisms, and anti-Chinese alarmism during the pandemic. Go ahead.
Right, thank you. Just testing my mic. Can you hear me? Right, okay. Thank you for having me on this panel. I've written, oh, sorry about my dogs. I've written down my thoughts and I'll use my 6 minutes to talk about my experience with racism as a Chinese student here. For the purpose of this event, I'm going to use the alias of Alex Lee, like I've done so in previous interviews on this topic. I came to Sydney for my degree 5 years ago, and I'm now completing my postgrad degree in law at the University of Sydney. In February this year, when the Prime Minister announced the travel ban, I was one of the tens of thousands of students who found themselves stranded in China. Since then, I've done numerous interviews with media in and out of Australia, and I've been subsequently engaged against my better judgment with people commenting under the news articles for which I've contributed my voice. The worst case I've seen was where an article had about 550 comments underneath, and most of them were raging and shouting different versions of fuck back to China, because no one wanted to engage or listen to my plea for sympathy. No one cared to look at the news links and facts that I tried to present. People simply just raged, and they raged on. The outpouring hate became very intense. I eventually disengaged and put up a Twitter thread with screenshots of online abuse I've received since then, with the hope that it will educate people that if you leave racism unchecked, it will eventually put people of yellow skin on the receiving end of real violence. That thread has since gone viral, having thousands of retweets, and yet the online abuse never really stopped. Still, I occasionally am receiving hate messages on social media. Then it became clear to me that, being who I am, a Chinese international student, I cannot have any meaningful conversation right now about China within the mainstream media discourse in Australia, because the moment I say something remotely good about China, even just a humanitarian plea for basic financial aids, which we international students are currently not entitled to, I'm then immediately shut down and swarmed by comments like, why should we let you in, or go back to your country, or oh, you filthy bat eaters, or accusations that we are CCP spies, or just simply, oh, hands off our tax money, because that's social welfare. I then realized from these responses that Chinese students are not and has not been seen as a part of the Australian society. Our political opinions are treated as irrelevant, if not brainwashed by default. What's worse is that our existence is seen as less deserving, both of help and of sympathy. If this is not hate, then this is some egregiously inhumane indifference. The scary thing about leaving racist hate unchecked is that I realize it's going down the road of normalizing real-life racial violence. After all, they will say, it's China's fault, China must pay. Then if we can't make China pay because China is too far away, oh look, there's some yellow coronas down the road, we'll make them pay. I have an Indonesian friend who was pushed down the stairs by a stranger, yelling racial abuse. He could have died then and there, but thank God he survived. I have a Korean friend who took a verbal onslaught on the street while she was walking her dog. The issue with racial violence is that it's really, really hard to run away from, not just for Chinese people, but for people with yellow skin in general. I have yellow skin, and people have eyes. They can see. So I don't know when or where this violence would be coming my way. And more importantly, no one should feel like they have to prep themselves for anticipatory violence when they are going on a trip to the supermarket. I realize my 6 minutes are running out. I'll finish up by saying that I won't even try to reach for the moon, but I just hope that Australia would treat us like real human beings with dignity, and acknowledge that we have a life here, we pay rent, we pay tax, we have friends, family, husbands, wives, and pets, and the fact that we're not a virus. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we'll hear from Shan Windscript, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Melbourne, finishing a thesis on diary writing during the Cultural Revolution. She's also a tertiary education union activist. Shan, can you talk a little bit about how China's position in the world today intersects with the construction of racialized nationalisms?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Mindy. Hello, everyone. I want to first acknowledge that I'm speaking to you in a country founded on stolen Aboriginal land. Sovereignty was never ceded, and resistance to colonialism is ongoing here. I want to also thank Alex for highlighting the violence of borders and racism in this country. In Australia, as elsewhere, the pandemic has given rise to a racialized viral nationalism, if you like, that converges with xenophobia and an increasingly belligerent narrative of rising China influence. This is not just some vulgar kind of fears or bigotry of the other. It's as Mindy said at the beginning, it's a nationalist discourse of social stratifications and exclusions. So here I want to unpack this racialized nationalism a bit, and I'll offer some thoughts later about developing alternative politics of belonging beyond the nation. And the context here would appear a bit Australia-centered, but my hope is to certainly to offer critique relevant to all nationalisms. As we face increasing global uncertainties, the ideology of nation has fortified everywhere to provide a false sense of control that justifies the dehumanization of certain figures of non-belonging, to borrow Sima Mohan Valavan's term. Fundamentally, this is a tale of underside of modernity, and the story of Australians' nation-making fits into this narrative or discourse, and it has always been a story of race-making. In recent decades, racial nationalism has joined what Martin Barker terms new racism, a mode of human distinction based on supposedly immutable, discrete and essentialized cultures rather than just biological hierarchy. Perhaps one of the most salient examples here is the rise of Orientalist civilizationism amidst rising geopolitical tension, where democratic ideals become racially and ethnically coded virtues to render the superiority of the national self against the unenlightened and corruptive other. The active construction of the China influence of CCP infiltration theory exemplifies this. When COVID-19 entered Australian political discourse, it tapped instantly into this long and rich discursive repertoire of racial nationalism and morphed instantly into a crisis of national security. This has provided a trump card for nationalists worldwide to revive and normalize border ideology. Even progressives seem to support the border. But as Alex has highlighted just now, the travel bans from China have intensified racism and anti-China alarmism, while the virus itself was being racialized and stereotypically linked to supposedly uncivilized, anti-democratic traits of Chinese people. Meanwhile, migrants are not eligible to the government's financial support, and at the same time, our Prime Minister Scott Morrison's telling international students to go home if they struggle financially. So what I want to highlight here is how race and nation are two mutually constitutive markers of division, which interpolate people into hierarchical, homogenized camps, characterized by unbridgeable absolute difference between us and them. And I want to emphasize that both the national self and its others are constructed subject positions grounded in conceived authenticity and humanity. As Paul Gilroy has suggested, building on Frantz Fanon's work, the supposed beneficiaries of race and nation, their self-consciousness was also amputated at a point where the seductions of raciology emerged in popular and political forms. And quote him again, they were offered an ideology of superiority, the glamour of whiteness, as a form of practical compensation for the loss of that universal humanity. I want to turn from here to offer some thoughts on left nationalism and minority identitarianism. And I want to say this, that the spectre of racialization and exclusion runs deep through all nationalisms. We've seen how collective nationalist anxieties in China reify and exploit the categories of the West, foreigner, and Chineseness. And we've seen the violence of these in the country's racialized subjugation of ethnic minorities and African and Black people, as Kun Huang has recently published in Position Politics, a translated version of her article. And elsewhere, we've seen racialized people resisting their marginalization by adopting a defensive identitarian position, embracing the same language of essentialism and exclusion that has excluded them from normative political community in the first place. And I think we've seen enough tankies invoking their great-great-grandparents and engaging in civilizationalist talks when they're dreaming up this sort of, broken national bloodline, such as the one quoted in Brian Hughes' recent article. The point I want to make here is that nationalism may appear in different forms, in different contexts, but it always speaks the language of closure and exclusion. And ultimately, this is a conservative politics that does not really challenge what has produced its exclusion and racialization in the first place. It's a political dead end that forecloses the possibilities of radical and translocal empathy and cross-boundary solidarity. Or, as Valovan puts it, it's a call for the excluded themselves to settle for a political future premised on their own splendid isolation elsewhere. I want to conclude by calling on scholars and activists in this room here to think beyond the nation as a natural foundation of identification and belonging. We need to foster new transformative politics of belonging and identification to cultivate a new political stance based on what Paul Gilroy again calls a planetary humanism, which expresses itself in an open, cosmopolitan, and agnostic stance toward the world and the suffering of the others. We need to recognize that the key to combating racism does not lie in the fortification of the same grammar of nationalist particularity. We don't need viral nationalism. We need a viral solidarity grounded in the principle of radical humanism beyond borders. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our third pair includes Kevin Lin and David Brophy, and I'll pose the very same broad question to both of them, which they'll answer according to their own experience and expertise. The question is, what does it look like to build solidarity from the left in the context of rising geopolitical tensions? Does this maybe offer us a way to develop a left politics that does not side with nations or states? And of course, even if it does, it clearly comes with challenges and risks. So let's first go to Kevin Lin, who is a labor activist, a researcher on China, and an editor for the Made in China journal. Kevin?
Thanks, Mindy. My own work has primarily focused on labor activism in China. And labor activism, of course, has been one of the areas that has faced particularly harsh repression in China in recent years. So there's a very strong need for international solidarity. Of course, international working class solidarity has always been the cornerstone of any progressive politics, and one of the most important ways in which we can combat nationalism and racism. And I think this task is taking on more and more significance in the new era of US-China rivalry. but this is by no means straightforward. So let me offer a few thoughts and reflections about building international labor solidarity. First, it's no secret that building international solidarity with social movement in China has got more and more difficult and complex in the context of the reverie. It is difficult because direct contacts with social movement activists in China, which has always been sensitive, has become considerably more risky to the activists. Building solidarity with little or no direct contact is obviously challenging. It is also complex because in the context of US-China rivalry, we all need to be very skillful in navigating the very fraught terrains of geopolitical conflict in terms of how we frame and direct our criticisms so that we make principled criticism and critiques and do not waitingly or unwittingly align ourselves with any state. Second, it's important to shift our perspective as well in terms of building international solidarity, not to see the act of solidarity building with social movement in China as the afterthought or goodwill gesture, but something linked very directly to social movements in the US, in Australia, and elsewhere. To use labor as an example, of course, there are obvious domestic reasons for the repression in China against labor activism, but there is obviously also a very important international dimension. The separation of workers' rights is a necessary condition for global capital to exploit Chinese labor. And in this sense, repression is almost a built-in feature of neoliberal global capitalism and is thus international in nature. The strengths or weaknesses of one labor movement in one place, in one country, often has impact on others, especially between countries as connected economically, as closely as connected economically as the US and China. And in times of rising tension, building labor solidarity is not only about supporting workers' rights per se, even though that's extremely important, but it's also crucial for countering the rising nationalism that the previous speakers have talked about, and the rivalry in which workers in both countries are the most likely losers in this conflict. So how do we build this solidarity? In the past, we have seen solidarity statements and petitions organized by activists and unions internationally that express support to workers in China. And of course, this is always very helpful in highlighting what is happening. But I think we also have to think beyond that and think of other ways that that we can organize and carry more weight in our interventions. Given direct contacts and support with Chinese activists are almost out of questions by now, I would argue that given the political situation in China and elsewhere, the best way to build solidarity with workers, and this goes not only with workers and labor activists, but all other social movements in China, is to focus on what can be done in the US or Australia or whenever you find yourself. For example, by participating in public debate around US-China conflict, shaping the public discourse of how China is discussed and how US-China or Australian-China relations are discussed. And also by concretely working with unions and other activist organizations, for example, around the issue of trade dispute, which has very little regard for workers' rights and often fuels nationalistic sentiments in both countries, or around the issue of student visa or the racism and discrimination faced by students. Or in another example, the kind of racism and that are confronted by, for example, the Chinese American communities. So working with Chinese students, working with Chinese American community organizers and activists, and working with unions and activist groups, those are extremely important tasks for the left today. Finally, I think China scholars have a very important role to play as well. And both Fabio and Sigrid have talked about the role of China scholars in the past in terms of building relationships and understanding and solidarity with the Chinese people. I think as a whole, the field of China studies could be fairly apolitical. But in time like this, it is very difficult to not become more and more political because the situation really forces us to take positions. And that's why we have come together as a group. Many of us have either studied labor or civil society or social movements, and which are obviously among the most prominent topic of research over the last decade. And I think this knowledge and analysis, which is based on years and decades of field work and research about Chinese society, is a very important basis for our interventions, our shaping of the public discourse on China in the US and elsewhere. There's a strong need to strengthen understanding about China in the US and elsewhere, and also among the US left. If progressive China scholars do not assume a more prominent voice in public discourse, the space, the field will be occupied and yielded to voices that purposefully push for caricatures and false dichotomies about China and US-China relations. And those voices will push for more tensions and conflicts that, of course, also fuel racism and xenophobia. There's another reason, I think, why China scholars should speak out more and engage more publicly. And here I include both professors and students, not just tenured professor, but also grad students and undergrad students who have an interest in China. Many of us have done research on and interviewed and even become acquaintances and friends with many of those who have worked in China's civil society, social movements, and people who are trying to make social change in China. And I think we owe them a responsibility to speak out on their behalf because they put themselves really at serious risk to advocate for people's rights. And especially now, given the very restrictive environment in mainland China, they themselves can no longer speak out. I think we have a special duty to speak out on their behalf. I think to conclude, there's no dispute that we are entering a very difficult period and environment, and there's no easy solution to the question of building effective international solidarity that goes beyond just good gestures and that actually carries social and political weight. This is very difficult, but we have no other option but to start working toward this goal and looking for ways to organize and build our own power. And this means, for example, in the very least, given our own positionality in academia, to engage more and more with the public on issues relating to China, but also make ourselves available as resources to activists because our experience and work on China for many years and in some cases for decades. So I think to conclude, we really came together to form this group, not just to provide analysis per se, but we want to work with many of you, with activists in the US, in Australia, in Europe, in Canada and elsewhere. And so please treat this webinar series not just as a lecture, but as an invitation for collaboration and for working with us going forward. Thank you.
Indeed, thank you very much. And we echo that invitation. So let's go now to our final speaker, David Brophy, who is a senior lecturer in history at the University of Sydney and whose work focuses on the political history of Northwest China, in particular on the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. David?
Thanks, Mindy. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. So obviously, I think we can all see the difficulties of this situation. Quite understandably, some of the people most invested in an issue like, say, Xinjiang or Hong Kong will see rising US-China tensions as an opportunity to receive the intention and support that they've struggled to obtain in the past. And, then for people like me to come along and say that those tensions are a bad thing can often be unwelcome. On the flip side, of course, you do have sections of the left who see these tensions as an excuse to go quiet on an issue like Xinjiang, or even to take Beijing's side. Sometimes those positions do reflect strong ideological commitments, but I think on both sides, it also reflects the marginality of the left, a distrust that the Western left can achieve anything either to support people in China or to combat American imperial hostility towards China. It's on us to rectify that. And the only way we can rectify that is by carving out a distinct, independent position for ourselves, not as an adjunct to one or either side in this conflict. So the starting point for that obviously has to be clarity about the situation and where we stand on it, that we oppose religious and national oppression. And that doesn't require that we support any particular political solution, say independence for Xinjiang. We want solidarity and unity between people of all nations, but repression and racism gets in the way of that. And therefore, I think that the right to national self-determination remains valid. Again, this need not require us to align with any political formation. How to navigate the messy politics here is a separate question, but we shouldn't allow that question to get in the way of or substitute for that first question. We don't support any and every initiative just because the situation is really bad. The seriousness of the situation in Xinjiang requires us to be equally serious in response. That means thinking through what the mechanisms for change actually are here and how we can realistically advance them. And honestly, there are limitations. We're talking here about solidarity, not acting as saviors from outside. The idea that the West can end racism and Islamophobia in China is as misguided as the idea that China can end it in the West. So we do need to ask, to what extent can Western public opinion or Western policy making actually influence China? And there are serious limits to that, particularly if China views Western actions as motivated primarily by an economic and political rivalry, and therefore concludes, legitimately enough, that concessions on, say, human rights issues will not be enough to change these basic dynamics. Now, I don't think that China is indifferent to the public shaming that it receives in the world's media. It is a cost, but there are also costs to America's actions too. Embedding the Xinjiang issue in the structures of American diplomacy is a cost in terms of the way the issue is perceived internationally, but also in terms of freedom of action for activists themselves. Now, right now, with Trump's obvious disinterest in the Uyghurs, it's easy enough to make critiques like this. That may well change come November if Joe Biden wins. He's better at articulating this issue with America's wider goals, but which is not necessarily a good thing. You might remember Biden in a presidential primary debate talking about sending warships to China's coast in response to Beijing's policies in Xinjiang. That's extremely dangerous rhetoric. It's dangerous for the people who are the victims of these policies. So what we need to do is persuade people that the goal of influencing China's policies in a positive direction is consistent with a strategy to de-escalate this conflict and combat its troubling domestic ramifications. I think even in conventional state-to-state political terms, I think that's true. We could ask, when did the Soviet Union ever really care about Western condemnation of its policies? There's times like World War II, for example, when Washington and Moscow were allies, not enemies, and Stalin's softening of religious repression was intended in part as a goodwill gesture towards the West. Now, of course, we're not talking about here, and the point of this group is not to, go back to, the conventional engagement paradigm. This is not possible. It's not going to solve the issue. But I think by disentangling Xinjiang from this get tough on China orthodoxy, we can start to think about a progressive approach. One key point here, obviously, I think, is that there's no better future for people in Xinjiang, East Turkestan, that does not involve winning more Chinese people to a position of sympathy and support for people suffering this repression. And so we can't combat China's demonization of its minorities as a fifth column while we're doing the same thing to Chinese in the West. We know that the policy direction in the West is increasing support for the party and its policies in sections of the Chinese diaspora. But the fact is, even in anti-CCP circles, in the West. Today's rightward pro-Trump lurch, bringing with it Islamophobia, is hindering meaningful solidarity between Uyghurs and Chinese. And I think it's really only the left that can provide a platform for that kind of solidarity, and that needs to be one of our key objectives. I still think that talking about ending the global war on terror is a key slogan here. It relates directly to the situation in Xinjiang, but is at the same time inherently anti-imperialist. I think it provides a meaningful entry point into discussion with other Muslim communities who might be sympathetic to the Uyghurs, but wary of American intentions towards China. I'm running a bit short on time. More could be said about specific campaigning issues which need to be considered, I think, on a case-by-case basis. But generally speaking, we need to work to ensure that other left and anti-racist campaigns are receptive to the issues such as Xinjiang, that we and our allies keep open communication with people in the Uyghur or the Hong Kong communities who become interested in what the left has to say. And just a final point on why I think this is important for everyone. Right now, these questions are localized to, places on the edge of China. But I think it's very likely that any rise of struggle across China itself will produce the same messy politics and invite the same kind of right-wing interventions that we see towards Hong Kong in Xinjiang. In that situation, the left has to be able to hold its ground and engage with that messiness on the basis of anti-capitalist internationalism. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all of the speakers, and thank you for the questions that have begun to come in. Let's turn to those. We have been taking a look at the questions and trying to aggregate some of them together. So we'll start with something that gets at a number of the things that people are talking about. So question one, how do we see imperialism as a mode of extraction and as a mode of territorial expansion? How do 19th and 20th century modes of understanding prevent us from seeing new modes of imperialism? Who can speak to that?
I can try. It's a very complicated question, and that's in part, that was my point of trying to sort of disarticulate imperialism as a concept that's applied. I think one of the blinders that we have now is that we think specifically either people who sort of define a country as imperialist as a country as not doing anything imperial in terms of that belong to different centuries, in terms that are like, still like pro-leftist pro-China leftists describe the intervention of China in Hong Kong as anti-colonial because it supersedes the legacy of British imperialism, and cannot be imperialist because this is China. It's a reconstitution of the national territory and the national identity. And obviously that it's completely, well, if that's true, then nothing happened. That's nothing happens at the ground level in Hong Kong. The entire history of Hong Kong, the entire history of China-Hong Kong relationship is completely flattened out. So in many ways, that's why I think we should sort of try to rethink how imperialism work. And I think 2 weeks ago, June was making a similar point in terms of, let's look at capital accumulation. Let's look at capital accumulation. The original relationship of Hong Kong to China was one in which Hong Kong was investing capital in China, and now it's reversed. And the capital shift as the capital accumulation pattern has completely changed. Does it still constitute imperialism? Yes, but then we have to rethink what it means. And I don't think we can stick with those old labels.
Does anyone else want to speak to this question before we move to the next question? All right, well, some of the other questions are interested in what some of the speakers said about reimagining identities and solidarities outside of national borders, vis-a-vis related concepts of self-reliance and international solidarity. I think, Sigrid, could you speak to that? And then if anyone else wants to add as well.
This is something that I've been pretty passionate about in my research, is looking at this concept of self-reliance. It's something I talked about in the Red Revolution, Green Revolution book. And one of the things that was fascinating to me about self-reliance is, for one thing, how influential it was on leftists all over the world, really. And, you know, Fabio had mentioned the Black Panther Party, which certainly derived a lot of inspiration, including, you know, with this concept of self-reliance. It was also very inspirational in Africa and in other places around the world, because it suggested that one could develop the capacity within, well, at the national level within, you know, a nation, but also then potentially with, you know, for the Black Panthers within a community that's, you know, not at the, you know, the level of the nation state. And so one of the things that has struck me as really interesting about that concept of self-reliance is how people from different political perspectives in different parts of the world really interpreted that concept differently and took it on and used it in their own, you know, political ways. And, you know, it doesn't always function at the level of the nation state, but people who were kind of more interested in community solidarities and, you know, thinking outside of state and national boundaries have found it a very potent political concept. So, you know, it's one of these, to my mind, it's one of these places where a category that has been used in a very kind of nationalist way, as a kind of a nationalist anti-imperialism or anti-colonialism, can also transform and can be inspirational for communities who take it in a different direction. And the other piece that's fascinating to me about that concept and how it functioned in the Mao era was that it married very well actually with international solidarity, because so much of the technological support that China was offering, especially in Africa, was premised on this idea of building the capacity for self-reliance as a anti-imperialist, you know, as part of the anti-imperialist politics and as a way for international solidarity. So for me, despite, you know, all of the differences in our own political context, and despite all of the, you know, kind of problems of that history, I take some inspiration in seeing how these concepts move and shift and can be inspiring for different kinds of political alliances and solidarities. So I don't know if that helps at all, but that's what comes to my mind.
I wonder also if Shan or Alex, one of you could speak to the politics of belonging and potentially how, you know, to make sure that this doesn't get hijacked by states and by nationalist discourses.
Yeah, sure. So I want to first by speaking about the idea of mid-20th century nationalist liberation movement. I agree with Sigrid that there was a liberating or emancipatory potential there, but importantly, nationalism was not only political language in those movements. And they, you know, activists and radicals, they had a very significant international outlook. And, you know, Pan-Africanism, for example, was for everyone, for all people of color. And there was, you know, great transnational activities from below. This sort of international outlook makes us think about today's, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement. even though it's, it's Black Lives Matters, but they are fighting virtually for everyone, every, oppressed group, including workers, white and black and brown and yellow. So it's these international and transnational alliance that we, as left people on the left or progressives, we need to exploit this sort of or amplify this kind of radical cross-boundary sameness, if you like, beyond the nation state. And I think these could be the basis of a more inclusive and progressive and radical politics of belonging for people. And also, just to wrap up, I think we need to pay attention to our everyday realities. I mean, look around yourself. I doubt that anyone who's living in a world that's purely, consists of their own ethnic sameness. We all live with, we all interact already with multiculturalism. We already interact with, diversity. But this kind of this kind of reality is sort of erased by the sameness and purity produced by nationalism, which, in my opinion, is an illusion. It overrides the reality of working class multiculturalism. So yeah, the 2-point internationalism and internationalism from below and everyday multiculturalism are my answers to this question. Thanks.
Thank you. So a number of people are also interested in the things that Kevin and David said about solidarity and how we express solidarity and act in solidarity. So Kevin and then maybe David, could you speak to that, please?
I can go first. So I want to just sort of say two things. One is, this idea, just I can't but following what Shan was saying. I've been thinking a lot more about the past year and a half. There's really been a huge wave, a global wave of grassroots anti-establishment and sometimes anti-capitalist protest movement globally, in Asia, in the Middle East, in Latin America. And in Africa, and now in the last few months in the US, and I think that has been extremely inspiring, because that the grassroots organizing and demonstration and protest on the streets are what transcend narrow nationalism or racism, because when you see fellow human beings, right, in other places, in other countries, struggling for very similar kind of issues, over similar kind of issues, and making similar kind of demands, holding government accountable, making sure people have a reasonable livelihood, etc., etc. I think those things, those class struggle from below, really help transcend narrow racism and nationalism and xenophobia. And then we see that that a protest, as Shan was saying, really could start from somewhere and then become a much more wide-ranging and sort of transcendental movement, as if you will. So this is also relating to the question of solidarity. I think solidarity, if it's more than just a good, as I said, goodwill gesture, it has to be based on the strengths of the movement, right? So for the American labor movement to express concrete solidarity with Chinese workers, it's not enough just to send solidarity statements or petition, again, as helpful as they are sometimes. It's also about having a very strong labor movement here in the US, because, well, which is already been developing thanks to the teacher strike, to other strike movement since in the last 2 or 3 years. And only when you have a very strong movement yourself can you actually provide concrete and powerful solidarity to movement elsewhere.
I just sort of when we talk about the prominence that an issue like Xinjiang and the Uyghur cause has received recently, there's a tendency sometimes to sort of give the impression that they're being showered in attention. And actually, I want to sort of take it in a slightly different direction and emphasize that, you know, on a day-to-day basis, people who are trying to campaign around these issues are still very isolated. That's certainly the reality in Australia. And so I think that there is some very basic work that we can do just to reach out, make contact, participate, help people organize events and establish a relationship of trust that can then allow us to have these more difficult political conversations. You know, that we're not just sort of flying in from nowhere with these critiques, that we've demonstrated a commitment to these issues. So I think that, you know, for those of us who feel safe doing this politically, you know, going along to rallies about ending the camps and, you know, speaking at these things and working with people to put these kinds of things on. I mean, it's just the basic sort of work that we need to be doing. Along with that, I think helping people find an audience for these issues, right? Because what the left is talking about here is, you know, it's quite challenging. You know, moving from a situation where you think that you have someone in a position of power who can do something to, you know, to dramatically shift this issue for you, to a left perspective, which is, you know, unfortunately is based on a, you know, much more grassroots, bottom-up campaigning approach. But I think on that basis, you know, helping people find an audience by linking these issues to groups and campaigns where, you know, they can find people who will connect and relate to these struggles. So, for example, I mean, in Australia, one thing I was trying to do was, you know, bring Uyghurs into refugee rights activism. This is a really important front for the left on these types of issues, and it's going to arise in the case of Hong Kong as well. So going along to the rallies with leaflets explaining the Uyghur issue and finding, you know, solidarity there, trying to bring people into discussions, conferences that we're having around Palestine, for example, there, and finding what sort of connections can be made there. I don't think there's any shortcut. I mean, I think it does have to begin with that kind of small, you know, network building work, and then, you know, gradually moving up from there. And I think that the model that's provided by groups like Lausan in the case of Hong Kong is something that we can all look to for ideas about how to do that. Thanks.
Okay, so another set of questions asks about how we can think about the difference between national state policy versus corporate power. So, for example, in Xinjiang with corporations selling to security surveillance, and then the US Congress and Trump expressing solidarity, maybe with Uyghurs. Can people sort of parse the sort of state-corporate relationships for us a little bit here?
I guess I can say a few words. I don't know if David, you may want to add. I think it's kind of easier for labor movement to make that distinction or have both have the eyes on both government, state power and corporate power. I think in the case of Xinjiang, definitely the sort of labor, the focus on corporations is extremely helpful, but I think there's also a risk of getting the movement entangled in the U.S.-China conflict. So I don't have a very easy solution, but I don't know, David, do you want to add to it?
This is a question about things like sanctions? That's kind of the
I guess
the thrust of the question. Sanctions boycott. Yeah. look, I just think it's important that, I mean, I think there are a lot of people who are interested in the idea of a grassroots campaign that would involve pressuring corporations to, you know, cut their ties with, you know, the supply chains in a place like Xinjiang and so on. And I think that, you know, often these are things that the left can support. I just think that we can't analogize the situation directly from, say, campaigns that are targeting a Western client state like South Africa and Israel. We have to have the holistic approach that understands the way in which the rest of Western policies towards China are complicating and getting in the way of our ability to actually generate pressure around issues like human rights, so on. Because, you know, people can say that, you know, we are putting sanctions on these products or so on, and this is because of human rights. But while the general trend is to be slapping sanctions on and, you know, killing off Chinese corporations in other sectors, you know, across the board, it's not going to be read that way in China. This is only going to be seen as one more attack in a wider campaign of economic pressure. And I think that raises the question: well, how effective is this likely to be? I think that really does create a very difficult question, you know, as to what sort of work can really be done here. But I think the first point then is to really stake out a very clear independent political position on all of these issues, a holistic perspective from which we can then engage on a case-by-case basis with specific campaigns as they arise. And I think, you know, certainly forms of boycott should be considered. I mean, I'm an academic who works on Xinjiang history. I'm not going to go to China and participate in conferences on, you know, Xinjiang history with people there while I have colleagues sitting in camp, you know. I'm not going to do that. But at the same time, I'm not going to advocate for a complete cessation of ties between scholars in China and the West, because I don't think that is productive, and that could easily play into the hands of, you know, the nationalists on both sides of this equation. So I just think we need to be very careful and you know, debate these things. We need a wider discussion, and this is, you know, part of the reason for setting up this group.
Sigrid, did you have something to add?
Yeah, this is not about maybe strategy for, you know, in terms of what the US or other nations should do policy-wise, but it does strike me that, you know, one of the things that's happened in the US with movements against the militarization of police here is that it's been very effective to make connections with the militarization of police in Israel. And indeed, you know, our actual police in Northampton, Massachusetts, was just about to, you know, send officers to Israel for training, and that was, you know, kind of narrowly stopped. And the connection then between the experience in the U.S. around militarization of police and the experience in Palestine becomes a way of forging this solidarity. And, you know, it strikes me that you know, very similar kind of solidarity can be you know, can be pursued with respect to surveillance, which, you know, is related to the, you know, often it's the same folks who are involved in that, in those campaigns here in the US around militarization of police and surveillance. And this becomes a, you know, a question of the technology and who's making the technology and how it's being shared, and the way these states are using similar technologies in, albeit, you know, very different contexts and different ways. But this, you know, I think it can be a way of bringing attention to the issue among grassroots organizers who are, you know, who are pursuing it here as well. I think that kind of solidarity could be very powerful in the future.
Thank you. All right, so there's another series of questions, again, sort of trying to get at what people think is the nature of China's power at the moment, whether it's imperialist, whether or not it makes sense to use these terms, whether they fit. And then sort of maybe a little bit more specifically thinking about both soft power. I know TikTok is being mentioned a lot in the chat, but then also thinking about the promulgation of the national security law that now gathers Hong Kong into its ambit. How can we think about PRC power, whether it's imperialist in relation to Hong Kong, in relation to Xinjiang, Tibet, or even farther afield in relation maybe to soft power in other places?
Just to connect this question with the previous one, I think we need, one of the things we probably need is a good anti-capitalist critique of all this connection, because we have this idea, which is, stuck in our brain, despite all the thinking we do, that, the capitalism works outside the states, there's free trade and people, the corporations are in large part separated and they are not in a relationship, while in China, capitalists work with the state because it's state capitalism and this thing. And this, an evil form and a good form, or whatever. But this is sort of obscure if you don't actually rethink that those relationships. And now in the Western world, capitalism is intrinsically connected with the state and uses the state as its, its military weapon, and, internally and externally. The police clearly, the criticism to the police within the US clearly shows that. And that in the same way, the similar relationship exists in China, only in different ways. If we don't unpack that, I don't think we can actually figure out exactly what it means to call China imperialist in Hong Kong. Sure, we can all go out and say, well, yes, China is behaving as imperialist power in Hong Kong. What does that mean? Does it simply mean sending in the police, or does it mean having a subservience relationship which imposes specific cultural values, specific, an erasure of history, or other things, or a completely subversion of law, or it means that there is really a tight coordination of capital coming from one side, imposing on the other, or that actually what's happening in Hong Kong, capitals on both sides agreeing on a particular form of government and a particular form of oppression. So, again, historians tend to make things more complicated, but I don't think those terms work anymore.
Does anyone else want to speak to that, or possibly the question that was just raised about, if China and the U.S. are both imperialists, although Fabio says they're not, but how do the differences between these things get measured, and what does this mean in terms of the way that we as leftists have to think about these powers?
I can jump in. I think Fabio is being a little bit provocative. I think that I don't have an issue with recognizing this is a rivalry between two capitalist states who are projecting their interests, and both in increasingly militarized form to their periphery and beyond. I don't think Australia, in its relationship to, say, the South Pacific, Southeast Asia, conforms to a classic model of imperialism where it's exporting capitalism, looking for markets, and so on. But I have no hesitation in saying that Australia is an imperialist power in its own right towards this region. And I just think we don't need to confuse the analytical dimension with the political dimension too. I think saying that shouldn't prevent us from acknowledging that wherever we happen to be situated, our primary responsibility politically is to challenge the politics, from our side that is contributing to the escalation of this rivalry as well. So I do think we want to claim back this term anti-imperialism. I don't think we want to tiptoe around it and be hesitant to adopt it. I think the fact that it has become identified with a particular form of pro-China politics is a real problem. It's a real problem for the left at the moment, and we need to change that, because we are going to need an anti-war movement. we have just in the last week in Australia, you know, we've made huge announcements about, you know, splurge on military spending, explicitly targeting China, talking about, you know, the need for preparation for conflict with China. This is a time where we do not start to need to talk about building an anti-war movement, all the while acknowledging that China is imperialist in the modern sense. It has issues within it that are a legacy of imperial expansion, you know, from the 18th century. Those issues are also conditioned by the impact of Western imperialism as well. We can't disentangle those things. Yeah, I don't think that we, you know, there should be any hesitancy to you know, to state our anti-imperialist position loudly.
I can add to that. I think we really need to be prepared to build a anti-war movement going forward. I think there's no reason to exaggerate the kind of the level of tension or the threat of war, but I think that possibility has become increasingly higher over the last few years. You know, it's just happening, and it's manifest differently in different places. It's kind of manifest differently in Australia, and again differently in Europe and the US. But nevertheless, you see both the sort of soft power competition, but also hard power, the kind of increasing tension in South China Sea, and also, you know, the ways in which the sort of rivalry is fought at a more regional level between China and India. And so I think there is definitely a increasingly stronger need to build a movement that is opposed to the war. And I think there's obviously important theoretical questions on the question of imperialism, and but I also think there are very practical questions that we can look at, which should inform how we see, you know, despite if I think two people can disagree about imperialism, but I think it's also very important for us to analytically understand the kind of what's happening and the kind of threat that the rivalries are posing, and sort of build alliances and bases from there. So I kind of just want to highlight the seriousness of what we are facing, and it can't be something that, again, it's an afterthought for the left everywhere.
All right, we are at the end of our time. Thank you so much to everyone for yet another incredibly deep and stimulating discussion. We really appreciate your attention and your engagement. We are reading the chat really carefully, and we're going to continue to talk about these things. As we've said, please visit us at criticalchinascholars.org to read our statements of principles, and join us for our next series of events. We will have more information on those soon. Keep in mind, we wanted to remind you that when you sign up for these events, Verso will ask you for a donation because they do so much to promote and host events such as this, but it is also possible to attend these events for free. So thank you again for being here tonight. We'll end there.